Chapter 7 of Beyond Good and Evil is entitled Our Virtues, and Nietzsche begins this section in aphorism 214 by repeating the title at the beginning of the text, but with a question mark at the end. Our virtues? And then he goes on to say in the first line that it is probable that we too still have our virtues. The we here, the our here, are the free spirits. And so, having taken us on this critical journey where he has attacked all of philosophy as being merely the confession of its author, more akin to the work of the artists and mystics, in the chapter on the free spirit, Nietzsche has gone after language, pointed out how the grammar of our language shapes our metaphysical and moral ideas, how all of these aspects of our thought, which are contingent on our time and place, are often responsible for the ideas that we then exaggerate into being of universal validity or importance. He has attacked religion as being a form of neurosis or of a form of pathology, and that this is part of his redirection of our focus in philosophy onto questions of psychology, the questions of the motivations of a given philosopher, his health or sickness, and considering the person, considering the source of where ideas are coming from, whether they be philosophical or religious. And then furthermore has then deconstructed morality by approaching it as a natural, evolved, living phenomenon, and with his analysis of life as essentially being will to power, he's described morality as a tyrannical impulse. He has found the source of herd morality in the collective's power and its ability to punish, and therefore to impress its demands upon the individual, cultivating the memory of the individual so that they can bring to mind the community's ability to punish, creating things like guilt and bad conscience. And furthermore, in the previous section, he has gone after the scholars or the academics, those who have dared to place science above philosophy and suggest that their pursuit of objective knowledge can be undertaken without regard for this essential process of values creation that not only defines the true philosopher's task, whereas, the scholar, the philosophical laborer, is just working within the existing values structure and sort of categorizing things and working within that purely intelligible realm. It also denies that value creation and valuations are, as Nietzsche says in the beginning of the text, these physiological demands for a certain way of life that then motivate all of our other actions, including our pursuit of truth and knowledge and our understanding of those things and their relationship to ourselves. But now, in chapter 7, Nietzsche is going to talk about virtue. And he is talking about virtue for the free spirit, so the person who is now unbounded from all of these mental, moral, metaphysical frameworks of thought, or we might say, I'm reminded of the term that Nietzsche uses in one of his letters where he says that he doesn't want to write with a logical corset, and that these could be like corsets of thought, right? Something that's restrictive, maybe meant to emphasize one thing and to hide something else. That whether it come from our conventional morality, the morality of all those around us, the moral opinions and valuations of the collective around us, or of society at large, or of the state, or of religions and the various religious ideas that permeate into our society and into our thought, or even the assumptions and the prejudgments that are baked into our language. Somebody who has managed to, at the very least, understand what all of these frames or lenses for viewing reality, these perspectives, what they represent, the meaning of their existence, their origin and their function, why it is they arose and why they survive, and having stepped into and out of multiple frames, having vivisected the moral perspective that lives and breathes around us in our culture today, one then begins to inhabit a reality that is self-aware of its own perspectivism and its own contingency. And this is the first step of becoming a free spirit, and in my view. It's, I think Nietzsche also describes this in his earlier work when he's talking about the idea of the wanderer, and he revisits this again at the end of his career in Ecce Homo, where he describes the process of philosophy as wandering in forbidden country. And so we have wandered that forbidden country throughout this text, and now Nietzsche waits all the way until aphorism number 214 to begin to give this affirmative vision of what virtue might look like. And what he means by virtue here, I wouldn't even describe it as anything akin to virtue ethics, because there's nothing here that reads like universal advice or like it comes out of a system or could help be a stepping stone in building a system. There's nothing like that here at all. Nietzsche is very comfortable not to define what a virtue is. And so we should just sort of take it on its face value that a virtue is something like a power that one possesses. We could say a virtue is an aspect of one's character, but really it's a trait, or we might say a quality, just as when one talks of the healing quality or the healing virtue of a given herb or herbal remedy or something of that nature, that it's a property or a power that you possess. And interestingly enough, in this section, Nietzsche will speak of virtues that many of us would regard as admirable. I wouldn't necessarily say within the conventional morality, but I would say maybe perhaps intuitively, and that there's something very sneaky about what Nietzsche is doing, and that he's presenting his new philosopher of the future, the type he's trying to create, in a way that we will still find admirable. And to really get into what I mean by that, we'll just have to dive into the text. So let's do that now. Quote, "Our virtues? It is probable that we too still have our virtues, although in all fairness they will not be the simple-minded and foursquare virtues for which we hold our grandfathers in honor, and at arm's length. We Europeans of the day after tomorrow, we firstborn of the 20th century, with all our dangerous curiosity, our multiplicity and art of disguises, our mellow and, as it were, sweetened cruelty in spirit and senses, if we should have virtues, we shall presumably have only virtues which have learned to get along best with our most secret and cordial inclinations, with our most ardent needs. Well then, let us look for them in our labyrinths, where, as is well known, all sorts of things lose themselves, all sorts of things are lost for good. And is there anything more beautiful than looking for one's own virtues? Doesn't this almost mean believing in one's own virtue? But this believing in one's virtue, isn't this at bottom the same thing that was formerly called one's good conscience? That venerable long pigtail of a concept which our grandfathers fastened to the backs of their heads, and often enough also to the backside of their understanding? So it seems that however little we may seem old-fashioned and grandfatherly honorable to ourselves in other matters, in one respect we are nevertheless the worthy grandsons of these grandfathers, we last Europeans with a good conscience. We too still wear their pigtail. Alas, if you knew how soon, very soon, all will be different." End quote. The last line, I think, is referring to the dawning of Nietzsche's extramoral age in the wake of the death of God. That pigtail that we still wear of our grandfathers, that is a rather funny metaphor, to me anyway, but going to look for one's own virtue, to believe in one's own virtue, to see that as something worthwhile or something that we affirm that we have our virtues, is, Nietzsche's pointing out, comes out of the desire to have a good conscience. And I think it is, again, Nietzsche taking off the mask a bit at the beginning of this section, and reminding us that he too is a modern person. Nietzsche probably struggles with these moral intuitions just as much as the next person. It's his penetrating intellect into the true natural history of where these moral feelings come from does not exonerate him from having to deal with these feelings. And I think he implies that here. And so there's the sense that we cannot simply have done with these moral feelings, that even as we transcend this moral age, there will be something that is left behind within us that may manifest in this desire to look upon ourselves favorably, to find a conscious interpretation of who we are, a narrative that we can write about who we are, such that we're able to interpret our own character in a way that is virtuous, to regard the character that we are fated to have as not merely necessary, but good. And how does one do this? Well, Nietzsche says in this section that we shall presumably have only virtues which have learned to get along best with our most secret and cordial inclinations, with our most ardent needs. In other words, this reaches down into the physiological valuations that are at the core of one's soul, right? In the same way that in the interludes, Nietzsche says that the nature of a man's sexuality reaches up to the heights of his spirituality. Or I forget exactly the way that he phrases it, but you have something which is instinctual and physiological, and what they would in former times call vicious, a vice or base, right? And that this is not the opposite of these high spiritualized values such as chastity or platonic love or any of these moral concepts that have populated the minds of the Western man now for centuries in this post-Christian civilization that we live in. But rather that, as Nietzsche has said earlier, it is owing to the fact that Christianity repressed sexuality that these ideas of like amour, passion, as virtues reach these never before seen heights in European society. That there is a deep relationship between what might be one's unconscious instincts and, as he describes it here, our secret inclinations, our most ardent needs, between those things and the conscious articulation of what we find good or ideal in our lives. Learning to see the ways in which our ideal has to, quote unquote, get along with all of those things about ourselves which are products of natural necessity, and which may sometimes, it's like the opposite of the ideal, right? It's the real, it's the physical. And so with that introduction of roughly what his project is here, we'll continue to 215, quote, "As in the realm of stars, the orbit of a planet is in some cases determined by two suns, as in certain cases suns of different colors shine near a single planet, sometimes with red light, sometimes with green light, and then occasionally illuminating the planet at the same time and flooding it with colors, so we modern men are determined, thanks to the complicated mechanics of our starry sky, by different moralities. Our actions shine alternately in different colors. They are rarely univocal, and there are cases enough in which we perform actions of many colors." End quote. This is a wonderful passage, and I think it is an example of Nietzsche's metaphor being so good that unpacking it is almost to impoverish it, and nevertheless we're going to try. We might call to mind the way Nietzsche talks about or uses the metaphor, the image of the star, the way Zarathustra uses it in his prologue, and the way Nietzsche uses it throughout his canon, that a star represents, to place a star in the sky or place new stars in the sky is to place a new value or table of values over mankind, a new ideal, The overman is the star that Zarathustra is setting in the sky. And this is a place where I could see, a critic of Nietzsche suggesting that perhaps he's contradicting himself, because isn't Nietzsche setting up an ideal here, which is therefore a judgment upon the real? And you could make that argument with the overman, but I think Nietzsche gives himself a lot of wiggle room by not giving us this fleshed out description of and here is the image of the overman and what he is like. He tells us how to live in a way to bring forth the overman, and even that is not a set of moral prescriptions so much as a series of sort of artistic, poetic images, right? But that kind of takes us on a tangent. I think the idea of the star as representing the ideal, the moral ideal, is apropos for interpreting a passage like 2:15 here. And he even says, we have a starry sky of different moralities. And he asks us to imagine a binary star system at the beginning, but then sort of goes on to suggest, imagine there are just, a dozen suns in your sky, or 2 dozen or 3 dozen. This is the nature of what the modern cosmopolitan existence is those countless sets of often competing or contrasting valuations, different colors that they throw onto life, which is it's why the metaphor is so good, I think, of these stars of different colors illuminating the world differently and in a way that shows how each valuation is its own perspective on the world. And even our actions are actions of many colors, that it isn't readily apparent even to ourselves in many cases as to which voice of which morality is whispering in our ear at a given time. And since it must be multiples at a given time, even, our actions and the entire structure of one's character is something that is so immeasurably complex. And I think to say anything more about this aphorism would be quite unnecessary. So we'll go on to 2:16. Quote, "Love one's enemies. I think this has been learned well. It is done thousands of times today in small ways and big ways. Indeed, at times something higher and more sublime is done. We learn to despise when we love, and precisely when we love best. But all of this unconsciously, without noise, without pomp, with that modesty and concealed goodness which forbids the mouth solemn words and virtue formulas. Morality as a pose offends our taste today. That too is progress, just as it was progress when religion as a pose finally offended our fathers' taste, including hostility and Voltairean bitterness against religion and everything that formerly belonged to the gestures of free thinkers. It is the music in our conscience, the dance in our spirit, with which the sound of all Puritan litanies, all moral homilies, and old-fashioned respectability won't go." End quote. So, to love one's enemy, this has been learned well. But Nietzsche suggests that it is not a pure love, that there are many colors shining in the act of loving one's enemy. And oftentimes it comes with a dash of spite or despising the person. And I think this is perfectly explicable if we consider that it is the Christian conception of love, which means love as a moral duty, which has predominated the psyche and still does today, and that to love one's enemies, to be mild and forgiving of those who trespass against you in your life, is felt by many to be a sort of duty, or that's what it means to be the most decent, respectable type of person. But both because in many cases, when somebody transgresses against us, even if we feel the moral duty to let it pass and take it in stride and, turn the other cheek or whatever our ideal of the situation might be, the immediate emotional feeling is often one of wanting to, enact a reprisal. At least in many people it is. And one might argue that the closer you get to man in his natural state, the more true that is, because it's sort of a requirement of survival, right? You can't let people push you around when the resources are scarce. But that furthermore, within Christian love, there is this sort of two-sided character that's Nietzsche has pointed to before, that there is an element of the Christian duty to love and forgive that is somewhat hostile and malicious, that loves and forgives out of this sense that a higher master than me will eventually punish you for your transgressions, that justice will eventually be done. And there is an element of loving one's enemy in the Christian sense that also relishes in their eventual destruction. And so I don't think Nietzsche is suggesting that this kind of, Christian resentful version of love is present in every modern expression of the civilized person who has learned to love his enemies great and small in all the ways that our rivals or people who might have it out for us in daily life, hopefully you don't encounter any of those, and most of us don't, because as Nietzsche says, this has been learned very well. But, that Nietzsche's not saying that in every instance where we love our enemy that this necessarily means this resentful feeling is there. It's just that there's something about the love as moral duty model that inherently, we might say, leads to that feeling insofar as one who has a faith in this concept of justice, for example, believes, as, going all the way back to Socrates, that the unjust person is going to get what's coming to them in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's, Socrates describing the myth of the river of Lethe and the self-forgetting that happens in the afterlife, after which it's the only thing you'll have is your character, the virtue that you've cultivated. That's the only thing your soul will have, because your memory will be lost. So those who have not cultivated that will eventually get their comeuppance in the afterlife, because they'll choose their next lives, the fate that's going to play out in their next life rather poorly. But whether it's Socrates' vision or the Buddhist idea of karma or the Christian idea of divine punishment and reward, there's always that element that the unjust man or the unjust person will get their comeuppance. Everyone will, whether they live justly or unjustly, right? And so love as a duty kind of has that concept like lurking in the background. And I think this is what explains this idea that Nietzsche says, that we can despise while we love, and precisely when we love best. But he says this is all done unconsciously. So it's the way in which these moral valuations, these moral demands have just been soaked into us, and we've been raised in it, and it's in our language and in all of the symbolism we use and the metaphors we employ and the adages that people speak and repeat to one another, right? That we don't even think about these moral presuppositions. But furthermore, I mean, he really is talking about the underlying feeling and the underlying state of mind or state of the heart that one might have, which is ultimately conflicted and divided against itself, as the Christian heart always is. And Nietzsche calls it progress, that because this moral enculturation has become just so inculcated in us that it's totally unconscious, and that morality can truly not be a pose for people. They truly can believe in it, and it actually offends our taste when we see a false, facsimile of morality. That he says that too is progress. Insofar as, the moral narrative might not be progress, but learning new instincts might be. That might give you a new virtue in the sense of a new power over the world. And we might think of the ways in which a figure like the saint showed mankind the way forward with virtues such as solitude or the ability for self-tyranny, which, we call discipline. We have that's another example of someone's, what Nietzsche would think, the saint, the figure of the saint comes out of somebody with these really strong baser instincts that then requires a terrible ability for self-tyranny in order for such a type to even survive within civilization. That the ascetics need asceticism because they have the most violent impulses, or at least that's one of the possibilities of the religious pathology taken to its extreme in the figure of the saint. But that there is something morbid driving the ascetic. So that's an example of sort of what Nietzsche's talking about at the beginning of taking this idea of a type that has to tyrannize over itself in order to continue to survive, and the conscious reinterpretation of that into a virtue. This is discipline, right? We make it something respectable, laudable, and admirable. We choose to emphasize that aspect of what is a deep necessity and which springs from our most secret inclinations. That is the project of creating a virtue. So the saint has already shown us how to do this in some sense. 217, quote, "Beware of those who attach great value to being credited with moral tact and subtlety in making moral distinctions. They never forgive us once they have made a mistake in front of us, or worst, against us. Inevitably, they become our instinctive slanderers and detractors, even if they should still remain our, quote, friends. Blessed are the forgetful, for they get over their stupidities too." End quote. Blessed are the forgetful. I think that line is worth highlighting simply because so much of Nietzsche's project, and I'll give you a teaser of season 4, we're going to begin with this topic, is discussing how life is necessarily forgetful and that the intellect exists within this space of memory, of life remembering itself, having awareness of itself. This all takes place within wherever memory has been created, the ability to remember. And Nietzsche, in many ways, is, if not against memory and pro-forgetfulness, is very much a fan of pointing out the ways that being self-forgetting is, in many cases, life-promoting, and memory, in many ways, becomes a judgment upon life. It's that within the space of memory, which is created, he argues, through great cruelty that civilization visited on its individual constituents, that our memory was created, right, where we were able to extend our memory and create a self-conception out of the need not to be punished by the community, to be able to act other than what our instincts tell us. And so I suppose it would just seem almost so obvious that the ability to remember and have a self-identity and thus be a thinking being is a good thing, right? We would all take that as a priori, usually, especially philosophers. And Nietzsche is simply standing for the opposite position, that forgetfulness had its virtues and that there is something also problematic about remembering. And so here, blessed are the forgetful, for they get over their stupidities too, in contrast to those who have attached great value to being credited with moral tact and subtlety in making moral distinctions. So a person who takes a sort of pride in their past moral aptitude, we might say, the person who likes being well regarded for their the moral character that they have crafted in the public narrative through their past actions. But Nietzsche says they never forgive us if they make a mistake in front of us. And we might think of, for example, how uncomfortable it is to catch someone in a lie. And I must admit, I've caught a few of my friends and acquaintances on lies over the years, where I know they're lying for one reason or another. But I don't think I can recall any circumstance in which I've actually called them out on it and said, no, that's not true, you liar, right? Because that's incredibly uncomfortable. And it's the kind of thing they would never forgive me for, even though it's their own moral failing, because there's almost nothing more embarrassing than to realize, in mid-conversation that the person, somebody who, is your friend or, at least should be your friend, is completely aware that you are bullshitting them. Very embarrassing, right? To have your lies unmasked nakedly. And, Nietzsche says, blessed are the forgetful, accordingly. The kind of people who are not taking stock, keeping a scoreboard of their own morality in life are going to be far more forgiving to you, the people around them, because they're more forgiving of themselves. The kind of people who can forget are the kind of people who can most easily forgive. And accordingly, this is, I think, the reason why this section is in the chapter Our Virtues. That type of person becomes able to turn the other cheek, in a sense, better than any Christian who does so out of a duty, which comes with that dash of salt and pepper, that spite or resentfulness, right? Of, oh, I love you, but you unjust person are going to get what's coming to you, and I, as a just person, am going to get the reward that I deserve for turning the other cheek and being the decent person. Nietzsche, in a sense, is saying that the person who simply forgets the slights against them, just as they forget their own moral failings and are able to move on, will forgive in a way that is far more virtuous, because we have all learned not to respect morality when it's simply a pose. And that forgetting is, therefore, to forgive in a way that is not a pose. And this ties in with the way Nietzsche talks about Mirabeau. This is from a passage in The Genealogy of Morals, where Nietzsche says that Mirabeau had no memory for insults and the vile actions done against him. And, the way Nietzsche phrases it is actually that he was unable to forgive simply because he had already forgotten the slight, right? But it's different ways of saying the same thing, right? That he didn't even have to forgive, would be another way to put it, because he had already forgotten. And so in a sense, there was no slight against him. And so I guess this is sort of expanding the idea beyond what Nietzsche's talking about specifically in 217. But blessed are the forgetful for that reason. Okay, 218, quote, "The psychologists of France, and where else are any psychologists left today, still have not exhausted their bitter and manifold delight in the bêtise bourgeoisie," which means bourgeois stupidity, just as if, enough, this betrays something. Flaubert, for example, that solid citizen of Rouen, in the end no longer saw, heard, or tasted anything else any more. This was his kind of self-torture and subtler cruelty. Now, for a change, since this is becoming boring, I propose another source of amusement: the unconscious craftiness with which all good, fat, solid, mediocre spirits react to higher spirits and their tasks, that subtle, involved, Jesuitical craftiness, which is 1,000 times more subtle than not only the understanding and taste of this middle class at its best moments, but even the understanding of its victims, which proves once again that instinct is, of all the kinds of intelligence that have been discovered so far, the most intelligent. In short, my dear psychologists, study the philosophy of the norm in its fight against the exception. There you have a spectacle that is good enough for gods and godlike malice, or, still more clearly, vivisect the good man, the homo bone voluntatis, or man of good will, yourselves. End quote. So Nietzsche's phrasing here, or perhaps it's something in the translation of the phrasing by Kaufmann, I think is somewhat vague insofar as it's not clear to me whether the psychologists of France are themselves to be described by this bourgeois stupidity, or if it's simply that they're taking a delight in it. And I tend to lean toward that latter interpretation, because it says they have a bitter and manifold delight in the bêtise bourgeoisie, the bourgeois stupidity. But then Nietzsche says, just as if, and then leaves off with a dash, enough, this betrays something. And what it betrays is not stated exactly, except that I think by implication, we could glean that perhaps it is both, that the bitter and manifold delight that the psychologists of France, and he singles out Flaubert, the delight that they take, which by calling it bitter suggests it's critical, right? That they are in some way setting themselves against the stupidity of the bourgeois, but their fixation on it or focus on it betrays something, that perhaps they are exactly the kind of people who see that in themselves. It's in their shadow, and that's why they're attacking it, to put it in Jungian terms. At least that's how I interpret this passage, because when he goes on to talk about Flaubert, he says he no longer saw or heard or tasted anything else in his life anymore. That this sort of fixation consumed him. And then Nietzsche rather abruptly seemingly changes the subject, says, oh, this is becoming boring. Let's look at another source of amusement. And from that line, we can gain that this entire meditation on the French psychologists is perhaps a source of amusement. And perhaps the way to explain this, because this is rather alien from our current cultural moment, France, in many ways, it seems like their intellectuals are either aristocratic or they are revolutionary. And sometimes they're both, right? Somebody like Voltaire, for example, or Rousseau even, that ostensibly they're either standing for the top of society or the bottom. And Nietzsche implies here ridiculing, sort of the middle managers and the functionaries and the small holders with all of their little, conventional modes of thought. And of course, they're an easy target. I think what Nietzsche is implying here is that this very fixation betrays that they are not so different from these types, and that what these men of goodwill, man who seeks the truth in order to do the good, that their time would be better spent considering the instinct of the norm to fight against the exception, which in many ways has been a running topic throughout Beyond Good and Evil. And again, I feel like I have I've accrued the credit to be able to, or the good faith in order to say something like this, because people will accuse you of being an obscurantist or something. But I feel like we did not shy away from Nietzsche's aristocratic leanings in the previous season, and in fact took that head on. And so I'm quite comfortable to sort of almost take the side of Kaufman here, having been open and honest about that, and saying that in many ways, what Nietzsche's doing in Beyond Good and Evil isn't just out-and-out elitism, but is actually pointing out the way in which, as he puts it here, the norm, so whatever is conventional, whatever morality is supposed to be universal, which is tyrannical over the minds of the many, the way that the many likes to stamp down the exception. And Nietzsche is quite honest in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that, as Zarathustra's last pity that he has to get over is his pity for the higher man, and that Nietzsche is therefore confessing in that way that is the toughest thing for him to get over, that ultimately, in many ways, you could say his project is a confession of his pity for the extraordinary or exceptional person who is attacked and smashed down by their own age and the people around them and the moral assumptions that preclude the work or the project or the ways in which that person is trying to be exceptional, which could have been a benefit to the society. And that when we phrase Nietzsche's project this way, it's a lot harder to take issue with it from the project of, or from the perspective of liberal individualism, which is the mindset that most of us, I would assume, listening to this podcast would share, at least to some degree. Even people who have far right or far left leanings who are listening have probably been raised in modernity and have onboarded many of its assumptions. So in any case, and he says that this will involve a vivisection of yourselves. So you psychologists who consider yourselves men of goodwill, and he uses the example of the French psychologists who are obsessed with the bêtise bourgeoisie. I think what he sees there is the potential to sort of elevate that critique and raise it into an attack on the entire structure of conventional metaphysical and moral thought. So at least That is my reading of the passage, though I don't think that Nietzsche is being particularly clear here, and I think also the cultural moment he's describing in France has long since passed. 219, quote, "Moral judgments and condemnations constitute the favorite revenge of the spiritually limited against those less limited, also a sort of compensation for having been ill-favored by nature, finally an opportunity for acquiring spirit and becoming refined. Malice spiritualized. It pleases them deep down in their hearts that there are standards before which those overflowing with the wealth and privileges of the spirit are their equals. They fight for the, quote, equality of all men before God, and almost need faith in God just for that. They include the most vigorous foes of atheism. Anyone who said to them, high spirituality is incomparable with any kind of solidity and respectability of a merely moral man, would enrage them, and I shall beware of doing this. Rather, I want to flatter them with my proposition that high spirituality itself exists only as the ultimate product of moral qualities, that it is a synthesis of all those states which are attributed to merely moral men, after they have been acquired singly through long discipline and exercise, perhaps through whole chains of generations. That high spirituality is the spiritualization of justice and of that gracious severity which knows that it is its mission to maintain the order of rank in the world, among things themselves, and not only among men." End quote. So the beginning of this passage, or the first half of it, we might say, is like, it's a beautiful, nice summary. It's an example of Nietzsche saying, in the length of roughly a paragraph, what others take in a whole book to say. Or, in this case, what he himself has taken a whole book to say, although you could say this book has covered a lot of other ground as well, that morality is a revenge against nature. And he draws that direct link between the idea of equality of all men before God and perhaps the ideologies of democracy, egalitarianism, and so on, but that this is malice spiritualized. That making all equal in the eyes of God is, and this is why they need Christianity and their faith. This is why they cling to it, why it is continually necessary for them. And notice that Nietzsche here isn't really talking about the successful in the material sense. He says those who are spiritually unlimited. It's the revenge of the spiritually limited against the spiritually unlimited. And so the spiritually unlimited are the free spirits, the people who are unbounded by all of these things we discussed at the beginning of this analysis that Nietzsche has taken us through his criticisms of, his attempt to kind of unlock the chains, right? And there are many for whom they will be unable to accept the keys that Nietzsche is offering them, right? They want to be chained down. They want the solidity and respectability. They feel it keeps them down to earth, right? That keeps them being within the conventional structures of thought and morality, and so on and so forth, is a sort of regularity and familiarity that the mass person doesn't take issue with. In fact, they will cling to this all the more strongly. And that ultimately the expression of this relationship, again, it's the war of the norm against the exception, but particularly in the domain of religion, it's the war of the church and its dogmas against those who might have been mystics or people who would promote heretical doctrines out of mystical, direct religious experiences that they'd had. How many examples of that do we have throughout the centuries of the church ruling over Europe? That this relationship is quite easy to understand in many ways. It's just that Nietzsche, I think, is trying to show us by analogy that the kind of philosophical project that road that he is setting us down is the road for the spiritually unlimited person. And even if it doesn't take the form of being burned at the stake, the people around you who bind their spirits to the conventional philosophies that have just been inherited or forced upon them by the people around them are going to resent you for it. But Nietzsche, he then says, well, I wouldn't want to say that having a high spirituality, being this kind of free spirit, is incomparable with that solidity and respectability of the merely moral man. That would enrage the spiritually limited people, so I'll be careful not to say that, right? So that's him taking the mask off, but then he puts it back on again, and he still gives us a statement that I think Nietzsche would say is the truth. It's just he's saying, well, let us put a different emphasis on what we are saying, and the latter half of the passage is more or less a recapitulation to the idea that something like spirituality is not the opposite of, so Nietzsche's high spirituality, as he describes it here, unlimited spirituality of the free spirit, no limits on your mind in the types of perspectives or frameworks that it is allowed to explore, according to, metaphysical or moral prescriptions that most people do follow and feel that they have to follow. That these two states of unlimitedness and limitedness are not, in fact, opposites, but that the person of this high spirituality is the one who has taken through, he says it's a synthesis of all those states which are attributed to merely moral men, after they have been acquired singly through long discipline and exercise, perhaps through whole chains of generations. And so the person of unlimited spirituality is the one who has followed through those virtues of justice and truth-seeking, and he adds at the end of that, gracious severity, which knows it's its mission to maintain the order of rank in the world, which points to something that, in a way, Nietzsche is once again making a rather manipulative argument here. And he's told us at the beginning that that's what he's doing, so it's fine. We can forgive him for that. That, once again, the free spirit, the immoralist that he has described and that he has attempted to create with this book is actually the perfection of all of the virtues that we admire, rather than the refutation of them. That they are, perhaps we could use the term, a sublimation of the, a leap from moral to extra-moral, not simply a regression to a pre-moral age, but having overcome morality. One does not do away with it, but sublimates it. It becomes, their spirituality really is the refinement and higher spirituality, or refinement and higher version or elevation of the common spirituality in many respects. This is just simply a consequence of the fact that all things are living and moving, and we might say evolving, to use the modern Darwinian parlance, that it's not as if the person of unlimited spirituality is truly some sort of leap out of the void, that they are the kind of thing that, or the kind of person or type that can emerge now after generations of culture have shaped the human mind. And, okay, so we'll continue. 220, quote, in view of the modern popularity of praise of the disinterested, we should bring to consciousness, perhaps not without some danger, what it is that elicits the people's interest, and what are the things about which the common man is deeply and profoundly concerned, including the educated, even the scholars, and unless all appearances deceive, perhaps even the philosophers. Then the fact emerges that the vast majority of the things that interest and attract choosier and more refined tastes, and every higher nature, seem to the average man totally uninteresting, and when he nevertheless notices a devotion to such matters, he calls it disinterested, and wonders how it is possible to act without interest. There have been philosophers who have known how to lend to this popular wonder a seductive and mystical transcendental expression, perhaps because they did not know the higher nature from experience, instead of positing the naked truth, which is surely not hard to come by, that the disinterested action is an exceedingly interesting and interested action, assuming, and Nietzsche leaves off with a long dash at the end, end quote. So the entire praise of disinterestedness, which is sort of the thing Nietzsche starts out attacking at the beginning of the book, because it's at the heart of our misunderstanding of the will to truth, is that this is a misunderstanding of the philosophical type himself, that it's simply because he is interested in things in this abstract, intelligible world. And he brings up Kant again here by sort of by implication. He doesn't mention him by name, but the Kaufman notes that when he says there have been philosophers who have known how to lend to this popular wonder a seductive and mystical transcendental expression, that it sounds as though he's speaking about Kant. And that Kant also was interested in a disinterested morality, right? Schopenhauer was interested in contemplation of the subject without interest. But the very sentence Kant was interested in, Schopenhauer was interested in, right? Nietzsche says this was both it was a psychologically fecund thing for us to look at, and he's explored it throughout a whole book, the psychology, the motivations of what these philosophers were doing. But they were themselves interested. And it's simply because in the sense that the ancient Greeks, their word for the wisdom of the philosopher is the same word for useless, right? It was useless wisdom or useless knowledge. The word for the wise man is the useless man, because his kind of wisdom has no utility for the common person. And that this is really what we're looking for when we're looking for the disinterested, the person who's not thinking out of how to gain some utilitarian advantage to himself, or something of that nature. That he's not just like a grifter, as we might say in modern parlance, right? Who's just looking to get paid. He's interested in something that seems to have no usefulness for the common person, or just for the average person, for daily life, for our practical needs and concerns. It's impractical knowledge, but that doesn't mean that it's disinterested, and that is the fundamental mistake, and that, in fact, these figures have been supremely interested. They were interested out of a tyrannical impulse that was trying to impose its morality on the world, oftentimes. So then Nietzsche, and then I think this assuming at the end where he leaves off, assuming what? Well, philosophy is an exceedingly interesting and interested action, assuming that we're actually talking about a philosopher, which is to say a commander and self-legislator, somebody who is driven by a valuation that he's trying to impose in the world, that is authoring this involuntary unconscious memoir. That is, like a font of psychological wisdom about mankind and what mankind is like and what the pursuit of the truth looks like, how our pursuit of the truth is always guided into these channels by our instincts. It may actually be the case that they are interested in something else, and Nietzsche raises that possibility in the very first book, and that in that case we're talking really more about a scholar, if their interest actually lies with making a living, or with having a family, or a career, or climbing a institutional hierarchy or something like that. But interest is always there, right? It's just whether the actual philosophy itself is of interest, because it represents the true interest and motivation of the philosopher whose confession it is. We'll continue, quote, "And love? What? Even an action done from love is supposed to be unegoistic, but you dolts, and the praise of sacrifices. But anyone who has really made sacrifices knows that he wanted and got something in return, perhaps something of himself in return for something of himself, that he gave up here in order to have more there, perhaps in order to be more, or at least to feel that he was more. But this is a realm of questions and answers in which a choosier spirit does not like to dwell. Even now truth finds it necessary to stifle her yawns when she is expected to give answers. In the end, she is a woman. She should not be violated." End quote. So remember, an action done out of love takes place necessarily beyond good and evil. But Nietzsche says here, he ridicules the idea that love is unegoistic. And we've discussed this before. Love is a tyrannical impulse, just like all the other impulses. And it's one of the most self-interested, selfish feelings in the world. Even as it is entirely investing importance into another person, right? Often in the form of like infatuation in the early days of, like romantic attraction. But even with like deeper, more profound forms of love, like love between a parent and their children, that type of love, Nietzsche is saying, is absolutely egoistic. They're your children, right? We make to kind of combine the two things, because he talks about love and he talks about sacrifices. If you as a parent talk about all the sacrifices you made for your children, you didn't make those sacrifices for other people's children. Were they not as deserving of, having, a good start in life and having the opportunities to do all these great things in life that your children have? I mean, from Peter Singer's perspective, they have just as much, value, and you should be giving just as much of a sacrifice for, all the disadvantaged children of the world as you should for your own children. Maybe that's a misrepresentation of Peter Singer, but I'm just saying, like, setting him aside, if we were to take a totally utilitarian view, seeing every life as of absolutely equal importance and the greatest good of the greatest many being the highest moral principle, things like your nepotistic interests in your own family's survival, this genetic allegiance that you have to your spawn, right? It's all completely irrational. And it's irrational because it is that kind of tyrannical impulse, and it's the expression of your desire. It ultimately originates with you, and it's based on the bond that you have, and the fact in the case of parents and their children that child will carry on your genetic line and your name and the memory of you, and that they are your legacy. And so this isn't to say that there is no element that is other directed in an act of love or an act of sacrifice for something or someone that one loves, that it isn't also for them, right, to put it into common terms. Nietzsche's point is that, and he brings us out in Human All Too Human very well, the dichotomy is false, that there is no purely selfless action and no purely selfish action. Our actions are always oriented towards the sake of things external to ourselves in some way. So all your goals in life have to do with things that are, unless it's just something like personal fitness, right? We might say that that's completely self-directed. But maybe you can find a couple other examples. But that in general, most of the desires and goals and aims that we have are directed at something external to ourselves, whether it's a person or a thing or whatever, something intangible even, an idea. But that the importance of it originates within you, within your drives, your desires, and it is for you that you seek out that thing or attempt to work for the benefit of that thing. It's very difficult to find a language to talk about this in general terms, but I think it's very obvious that when people talk about sacrificing for their children, right, that there is something like the love that motivates them to do that is not, strictly speaking, a selfless love. It is, if it was truly selfless, they would live more like a Buddhist monk or a Jedi Knight, right? Where they're obliged to love everyone out of duty, but have none of these special familial or romantic attachments to individuals. Your love has to be for all the world. But, if your sacrifices are not of that nature, if they're not for all the world, if you're giving something up here in order to have more there, if you're saying, I will give up some of my wealth that I have so that I can give my child a good start into this world, that's not a selfless sacrifice. That's still for you. And we dress up all these things with moral language for various reasons, partly because we've been enculturated to view other-directed, selfless action as being the only moral action, as being disinterested action, which Nietzsche thinks is just, in some sense, just a delusion that there is anything disinterested at all. Like life is interest. Existence as we know it is interest. It's desire, drive. And love, sacrifice, all these things are no different, but because of the fact that to truly understand or comprehend something like love, and this is the reason why it can never really be properly defined, we have to confound two apparent opposites of selflessness and selfishness under a single label in order to really understand it, because we've actually made a false dichotomy between them. But this categorical way that we think, structured by our language, isn't really able to neatly contain both X and not X at the same place and the same time. In fact, our entire logical systems for approaching philosophy and thought in general would seem to preclude that. That's Aristotle's most assured proposition, that the law of non-contradiction. And in many ways, Nietzsche is promoting the law of contradiction. at least in some cases. And so that's why, truth sort of yawns when she's expected to give answers to this, because we're never going to be able to bring this into the clear understanding of our language. It's something you have to simply know for yourself on some sort of level that's perhaps even deeper than language and can't be articulated. And trying to draw out things that can't be articulated through this like linguistic browbeating is to violate Sophia, the beautiful woman who is truth. And so that is the meaning, I think, of Nietzsche's metaphor at the end there. 221, quote, "It does happen, said a moralistic pedant and dealer in trifles, that I honor and exalt a man free of self-interest, not because he is free of self-interest, but because he seems to me to be entitled to profit another human being at his own expense. Enough. The question is always who he is and who the other person is. In a person, for example, who is called and made to command, self-denial and modest self-effacement would not be a virtue, but a waste of virtue. Thus it seems to me. Every unegoistic morality that takes itself for unconditional and addresses itself to all does not only sin against taste, it is a provocation to sins of omission, one more seduction under the mask of philanthropy, and precisely a seduction and injury for the higher, rarer, privileged. Moralities must be forced to bow first of all before the order of rank. Their presumption must be brought home to their conscience until they finally reach agreement that it is immoral to say what is right for one is fair for the other. Thus, my moralistic pedant in Bonhomme, does he deserve to be laughed at for thus admonishing moralities to become moral? But one should not be too right if one wants to have those who laugh on one's own side. A grain of wrong actually belongs to good taste." End quote. So Nietzsche, in many ways, is pointing out how his own position, he's saying a moralistic pedant and dealer in trifles, and then is sort of giving all of this as issuing from this character, someone who's being moralistically pedantic, somebody who's presuming to tell you how to live your life as, from their own moral standpoint. And I think it's clear what Nietzsche means by putting these arguments into the words of this unnamed moral pedant, is when he says, that moralities ought to reach agreement that it is immoral to say what is right for one is fair for the other, right? What's good for the goose is what's good for the gander, as we say in English. That's what's good for one person ought to be good for everyone. Universalism ought to be seen as immoral. And so what is the section 221? Well, it's Nietzsche admitting he's phrasing his own philosophy into the pedantic, moralistic form. He's becoming a moralistic immoralist and saying, what if I were to take my rejection of the universal dogmatic forms of moralism found throughout this text and turn that into my own form of moralism? That we immoralists should say that it is immoral to be moralists. He more or less before that just summarizes what I've again described as the confession of Nietzsche's pity for the higher man that is throughout this text, or pity for the extraordinary person or the exception against the norm. So in a person who is made to command, self-denial and modest self-effacement would not be a virtue, but a waste of virtue. So your dogmas can never be made universal. Your dogmas of selflessness and of humility and timidity have to be permitted, the exception within your society must be permitted to not live under this type of moral dominion. But that's why Nietzsche says, thus my moralistic pedant in Bonhomme, does he deserve to be laughed at for thus admonishing moralities to become moral? Like all moralists, Nietzsche would simply be saying that he has a higher universal dogma of morality than any of the others that have come before. And that is, of course, what they all say. And they all, it would just make him yet another moralist. But it's interesting that Nietzsche, he doesn't really address this charge. He says, a grain of wrong actually belongs to good taste. One should not be too right if one wants to have those who laugh on one's own side. So one way of explaining this, I think, is that, of course, Nietzsche has his own set of valuations that he's trying to impose on the world. That's never really been in question. He's been quite open about that from the very beginning, and much of his point is simply no other philosopher has ever been any different, which is nevertheless a sort of universalist claim and a sort of universalist prohibition and ban on any universal perspective, which is paradoxical. It's paradoxical to state a rejection of universal truth in universal terms. That is simply one of the ironclad rules of our language in the grammar of thought, which means that by stating a paradox, Nietzsche is a little bit wrong here. But you should be a little bit wrong. And we might call back to one of the earlier aphorisms that to recognize untruth as a condition of life, that would necessarily place one's philosophy beyond good and evil. The silliness of the paradox of universally rejecting universalism, Nietzsche doesn't eschew, but embraces and says, sure, I'm embracing something that is technically a little bit wrong. It's fallacious, right? But I laugh at that because I know that I'm pointing to or elucidating a deeper truth that is beneath any sort of conscious linguistic capitulation to it. And it's for this very reason, by the way, that Nietzsche's position can never be universalized. It will never work. It just for the sake that, or for the reason that it will never be accepted by everyone, and also because it's impossible to state it in a way that will make it palatable to everyone. 222, quote, where pity is preached today, and if you listen closely, this is the only religion preached now, psychologists should keep their ears open. Through all the vanity, through all the noise that characterizes these preachers, like all preachers, they will hear a hoarse, groaning, genuine sound of self-contempt. This belongs to that darkening and uglification of Europe, which has been growing for a century now, and whose first symptoms were registered in a thoughtful letter Galliani wrote to Madame d'Épinay. Unless it is the cause of this process, the man of modern ideas, this proud ape, is immeasurably dissatisfied with himself. That is certain. He suffers, and his vanity wants him to suffer only with others, to feel pity. End quote. So, this section, I think, is very straightforward, given that we've already covered Nietzsche's critique of pity. The important parts are that pity is preached today, and he says if you listen closely, it's the only religion preached today. That in some sense, regardless of whether you're getting pity out of the Christian doctrine or the socialist doctrine or the democratic doctrine or the utilitarian doctrine or even the positivists who ultimately still recapitulate to utilitarianism or to pragmatism or something of that nature, that ultimately pity is the meme, the cultural idea that was being transmitted through Christianity, and that this meme has mutated and escaped even from this old superstitious metaphysical framework of Christianity, and in some sense is much better off for it. It's much stronger for it. And Nietzsche says, of course, that's not the point of the passage to say that, is simply to say the preaching of pity is everywhere, it takes many forms, and you'll always hear beneath it a genuine sound of self-contempt, because there is something by preaching pity as the ultimate value and the awareness that everyone has that they are not living in a completely selfless manner. That this is why pity is like an eternal condemnation and attack on life and on nature, by the way, because true love, true selflessness, true sacrifice, all of these beautiful moral things are actually inextricably bound up with selfishness, with gaining self-advantage, and with egoistic concerns. That the truly selfless deed does not exist, and we all know this on some intuitive level. And so, and out of the awareness also that we're not doing everything we possibly could, sacrificing everything we possibly could to reduce the amount of suffering in the world, that we are allowing, because we can't bear, as Nietzsche says in an earlier passage, to simply be spectators and let someone or something suffer any longer. That is unbearable to us in the form that we have been shaped into by this process of civilizing people. And so there's always this self-condemnation, this self-contempt, this groaning, genuine sound of self-contempt. And that this, by making pity universal, we have made self-contempt universal in Europe. And the man of modern ideas is, he calls him a proud ape who is immeasurably dissatisfied with himself. And is that not truer than ever in the 21st century? Okay, let's move on to 223. Quote, "The hybrid European, all in all a tolerably ugly plebeian, simply needs a costume. He requires history as a storage room for costumes. To be sure, he soon notices that not one fits him very well, so he keeps changing. Let anyone look at the 19th century with an eye for these quick preferences and changes of the style masquerade, also for the moments of despair over the fact that nothing is becoming. It is no use to parade as romantic or classical, Christian or Florentine, Baroque or national, in moribus et artibus. It does not look good. But the spirit, especially the historical spirit, finds its advantage even in this despair. Again and again, a new piece of prehistory or a foreign country is tried on, put on, taken off, packed away, and above all, studied. We are the first age that has truly studied costumes. I mean those of moralities, articles of faith, tastes in the arts, and religions, prepared like no previous age for a carnival in the grand style, for the laughter and high spirits of the most spiritual revelry, for the transcendental heights of the highest nonsense and Aristophanean derision of the world. Perhaps this is where we shall still discover the realm of our invention, the realm in which we too can still be original, say, as parodists of world history and God's buffoons. Perhaps, even if nothing else today has any future, our laughter may yet have a future." End quote. So, I'll just give a short summary of this one. This is Nietzsche discussing yet again the age of comparisons. That there is something, you might say, that is farcical or lamentable about the fact that all of these past cultures and traditions, nationalities, and, the love and devotion that people had to a certain national identity, in Europe today, this hybrid European sees all of these things as mere costumes to put on. They're not within him. They're on the outside. They're an adornment. That's what culture has become. And this is often sort of the sorrow of the conservative, right? He sees the ways in which, to the extent our tradition even lives on at all, it's now just a costume. It's a costume that people wear in a parade once a year, or that, is just simply a distillation of a few stereotypical things about the old days, but that the old way of life is gone. That old way of looking at the world, no one earnestly believes it anymore. But in exchange for that, for having made all of these costumes and put them all into the wardrobe of the hybrid European, it allows for this age of comparisons to take place, where the prehistory of a foreign country is tried on, put on, taken off, packed away, and above all studied. We're the first age that has first truly studied costumes. And Nietzsche says what he means by that are articles of faith, tastes in the arts, religions, moralities. And that this has prepared us for a carnival like no age has ever seen. This comparison of all of these, the many suns of different types of light that we now live under. It's another statement of that type of metaphor. But here explicitly showing us how this contrast between all of these different moralities, religions, articles of faith is a realm in which we could become inventors. That by having made all of these allegiances and commitments to cultural ideas into mere costumes, which can simply be put on, taken off, and studied, these various perspectives or the various light that these articles of faith used to cast onto the world can now be used and sort of combined and focused. And, with his last line about laughter, he's indicating once again where the the kind of people who will laugh, be willing to be a little bit wrong, to have our grains of paradox or fallaciousness in our thought, to recognize untruth as a condition of life, the person of unlimited spirituality, of high spirituality, the free spirit. Moving on to 224, quote, "The historical sense, or the capacity for quickly guessing the order of rank of the valuations according to which a people, a society, a human being has lived, the divinatory instinct for the relations of these valuations, for the relation of the authority of values to the authority of active forces. This historical sense to which we Europeans lay claim as our specialty has come to us in the wake of that enchanting and mad semi-barbarism into which Europe had been plunged by the democratic mingling of classes and races. Only the 19th century knows this sense as its sixth sense." End quote. So the historical sense, which arrives in the 19th century, often also associated with Hegel, or we could consider Karl Marx, who, rather than looking at idealism, ideas as something of a historical phenomenon, truth as a historical phenomenon, looks at material realities as a historical phenomenon. And then, of course, Darwin, who sees biological life forms as historical beings. But what Nietzsche is defining the historical sense, he says, the capacity for quickly guessing the order of rank of the valuations according to which a people, a society, a human being has lived. The relations of these valuations, the relation of the authority of values to the authority of active forces. So for Nietzsche, the historical sense is something like an instinct, the capacity for quickly guessing. It's like an intuition, it's an aptitude, and it is more or less synonymous with the perception of perspectivism, that Nietzsche's historical sense is necessarily a perspectival sense, a sense for the ways in which values have reshaped the perspective, the way of life, the way of being, or the way of becoming, we might say, of various, to which he says a people, a society, or a human being has lived. To be able to view life through those perspectives. That is, for Nietzsche, what constitutes the historical sense, which is the way in which Nietzsche might be distinguished from a Hegel or a Darwin or a Marx, in that he centers values, in other words, our desires, drives, or interests as the content of what life is, and thus the differences in those values as defining the differences between an age. That is what is becoming in time, is at bottom valuations and drives, the transformation of those. And once again, at the end of that sentence, he suggests that it is in this age of comparisons that we have gained the historical sense, this perspectivism. Continuing, quote, "The past of every form and way of life, of cultures that formerly lay right next to each other or on top of one another, now flows into us modern souls thanks to this mixture. Our instincts now run back everywhere. We ourselves are a kind of chaos. Finally, as already mentioned, the spirit sees its advantage in this. Through our semi-barbarism in body and desires, we have secret access in all directions, as no noble age ever did. Above all, access to the labyrinths of unfinished cultures and to every semi-barbarism that ever existed on earth. And insofar as the most considerable part of human culture so far was semi-barbarism, historical sense almost means the sense and instinct for everything, the taste and tongue for everything, which immediately proves it to be an ignoble sense." End quote. So it requires that culture cease to become a way of being and become a mere costume. This is what he means by semi-barbarism. I'm reminded of the essay on the use and abuse of history for life, where externally we are, our version of culture is like being an encyclopedia of trivium, but internally none of that knowledge has truly been internalized. And so he says that our modern historical education should be called like Manual of External Culture for Internal Barbarians. And that for the Greeks, for example, the knowledge that they possessed had to be life-serving in some sense, that all of the knowledge that they gained was integrated into their life in a a very real or very physical way. Whereas for us, this historical, this pondering of other perspectives, while still holding them at a distance in some sense, because it's simply a comparison and contrast of all of these cultures, which are merely different lights or perspectives through which we can look at the world. This is necessarily something ignoble, Nietzsche says. So the noble modes of valuation and living were necessarily close-minded and self-assured and unquestioning of their own values. And we've discussed this before. So Nietzsche here is seeing that cosmopolitanism, that plebeianism, all of these artifacts of modernity that he would have seemed to have criticized throughout this text as the necessary precondition of the kinds of world perspective that will be required to have a truly free spirit today. The things Nietzsche has criticized are not, they're not things that he dogmatically criticizes insofar as he wishes that they never happened. He's seeing them as a necessary step, something that is good because it is necessary, and therefore paves the way for this unlimited spirituality of the free spirit in the future. All right, so we'll finish out the passage, and I'm going to skip over a little bit of a sentence that's kind of just like references that don't really add much to the section. Quote, "We enjoy Homer again, for example. Perhaps it is our most fortunate advantage that we know how to relish Homer, whom men of a noble culture cannot and could not assimilate so easily. The very definite yes and no of their palate, their easy nausea, their hesitant reserve toward everything foreign, their horror of the poor taste even of a lively curiosity, and altogether the reluctance of every noble and self-sufficient culture to own a new desire, a dissatisfaction with what is one's own, an admiration for what is foreign, all this indicates and disposes them unfavorably even against the best things in the world, which are not theirs or could not become their prey. No sense is more incomprehensible for such people than the historical sense and its submissive plebeian curiosity." End quote. So I think, given what we sort of talked about, that chunk was relatively clear. And Nietzsche next makes a comparison between Shakespeare, who was Shakespeare comes at a time where he can take influences from different dramatic styles throughout Europe, whereas in contrast, in ancient Athens, a playwright like Aeschylus would simply be working within his own cultural canon, because that was, Nietzsche would say a noble culture simply has no interest in anything else, but in some sense they didn't have access or any familiarity with anything else. And if they did, I suppose Nietzsche's right to a degree. It's like they're not going to dabble in Persian forms of art. They think of themselves as, say, superior to the Persians and their enemy, right? Their entire attitude is not one of submitting to all these different styles to, compare and contrast them. And so Nietzsche, he makes a brilliant metaphor in describing sort of how he can counterbalance his own elitist leanings, we might say, with this understanding of cosmopolitanism as a necessary step in the creation of the free spirit. He talks about that in this following paragraph, quote, "It is no different with Shakespeare, that amazing Spanish, Moorish, Saxon synthesis of tastes that would have all but killed an ancient Athenian or Aeschylus's circle with laughter or irritation. But we accept precisely this wild abundance of colors, this medley of what is most delicate, coarsest, and most artificial, with a secret familiarity and cordiality. We enjoy him as a superb subtlety of art, saved up especially for us, and the disgusting odors and the proximity of the English rabble, in which Shakespeare's art and taste live, we do not allow to disturb us any more than on the Chiaja of Naples, where we go on our way with all our senses awake, enchanted and willing, though the sewer smells of the plebeian quarters fill the air." End quote. And I'm sure if you've ever been to a beautiful historical city that's still a major metropolitan center, you've probably had that experience where you can Most big cities smell badly for obvious reasons. And you can be walking with all of your senses awake and enchanted and not even be disturbed by, oh God, there's a nasty smell over there, right? It's just part of the city and part of the living entity of the city, right? Living things don't always smell good, is one way to put it. Okay, continuing, quote, "As men of the historical sense, we also have our virtues. That cannot be denied. We are unpretentious, selfless, modest, courageous, full of self-overcoming, full of devotion, very grateful, very patient, very accommodating. But for all that, we are perhaps not paragons of good taste. Let us finally own it to ourselves. What we men of the historical sense find most difficult to grasp, to feel, to taste once more, to love once more, what at bottom finds us prejudiced and almost hostile, is precisely the perfection and ultimate maturity of every culture and art, that which is really noble in a work or a human being, the moment when their sea is smooth and they have found halcyon self-sufficiency, the golden and cold aspect of all things that have consummated themselves." End quote. And I'll just point out that, once again, Nietzsche is trying to make us men of the historical sense, right, the free spirits who have sublimated this project of comparing and contrasting all modern ideals to arrive at this perspectivism that even then rejects many of the prejudices and dogmas of the age of which we emerged, because we see the ways in which those are still, for example, inherited from Christianity, among other things, or simply represent false ideas or life-undermining ideas. We immoralists, by that very act, have our virtues too. And all of the things that he lists were unpretentious, selfless, modest, courageous, full of self-overcoming, full of devotion, very grateful, very patient, very accommodating. He's not describing, a barbaric, Conan the Barbarian, slitting throats and, burning towns to the ground. He's not describing Sauron. And this is, I think there are some who tend to focus on Nietzsche talking about the return to nature, the atavistic type, like Napoleon, and see that as sort of his ideal for the overman. But I think this is just as important, that the philosopher of the future, as he describes it, is not just a refutation of modernity, which it is, but it's also a product of modernity and a transmutation of it, a transformation of it. We'll finish out the passage. Quote, "Perhaps our great virtue of the historical sense is necessarily opposed to good taste, at least to the very best taste, and precisely the highest little strokes of luck and transfigurations of human life that briefly light up here and there, we can recapture only poorly, hesitantly, by forcing ourselves. Those moments and marvels when great power voluntarily stopped this side of the immeasurable and boundless, when in excess of subtle delight and sudden restraint and petrification and standing firm and taking one's measure was enjoyed on still trembling ground. Measure is alien to us. Let us own it. Our thrill is the thrill of the infinite, the unmeasured. Like a rider on a steed that flies forward, we drop the reins before the infinite, we modern men, like semi-barbarians, and reach our bliss only when we are most in danger." End quote. So, yet another example of how, the things that interested a Kant or a Hegel or a Descartes, all of those great philosophers that Nietzsche has criticized, even going back to Plato, the intelligible world is what interests us philosophers. That is still what interests the free spirit or the philosopher of the future. It's just that he, in some sense, you can phrase Nietzsche's critique that he's more honest about what the intelligible world is than any of those other figures. But in some sense, what Nietzsche's focusing on here, our thrill is the thrill of the infinite. Measure is alien to us. And so, in a way, that's attacking the previous modes of philosophy or thought, because in some sense they're based on measure. But in another way, Nietzsche's pointing out how the infinite, which is necessarily a concept, right? Because the infinite is never something that we encounter in nature in any sort of concrete form. It's a conceptual mediation that we introduce in order to understand something about reality. Infinity is really a direction, you could say. And you can understand infinity conceptually in that manner, that you have perhaps no quantity on one side and infinite quantity on the other side of the spectrum, and you never reach infinity, but you can infinitely proceed on that spectrum towards infinity. And this relates to Nietzsche's idea of the overman, how mankind and all living things as becoming things in some sense have infinite potential, because there's never a final state that is reached. Nietzsche is very opposed to final states. He thinks that if there could ever be a final state reached in the universe or realized, it would have already been realized, which implies there is no final state. There's just simply an endless process or dynamic of becoming. And that means that the possibilities for change and transformation are endless and infinite. So this is still the world that these are all very conceptual, philosophical concerns, right? And so once again, Nietzsche's project is to point out how all of the philosophers were indeed interested, and that we too are interested in the same things. We are interested in concepts where you can have things like the boundless. And that this is, in some sense, at the end, his lines are, again, about bringing back that sense of danger, or of philosophy being a thrilling, dangerous task. Okay, 225. Quote, whether it is hedonism or pessimism, utilitarianism or eudaimonism, all these ways of thinking that measure the value of things in accordance with pleasure and pain, which are mere epiphenomena and wholly secondary, are ways of thinking that stay in the foreground in naivetes, in which everyone conscious of creative powers and an artistic conscience will look down on, not without derision, nor without pity. Pity with you, that of course is not pity in your sense. It is not pity with social distress, with society and its sick and unfortunate members, with those addicted to vice and maimed from the start, though the ground around us is littered with them. It is even less pity with grumbling, sorely pressed, rebellious slave strata who long for dominion, calling it freedom. Our pity is a higher and more far-sighted pity. We see how man makes himself smaller, how you make him smaller, and there are moments when we behold your very pity with indescribable anxiety, when we resist this pity, when we find your seriousness more dangerous than any frivolity. You want, if possible, and there is no more insane if possible, to abolish suffering. And it really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible, that makes his destruction desirable. End quote. So, hedonism or pessimism, utilitarianism or eudaimonism. So every form of normative ethics that attempts to impose an ethical philosophy on the world has measured the world in accordance with the value of pleasure and pain. But Nietzsche says these are mere epiphenomena. These are surface-level phenomena of the consciousness of the conscious subject that are mere instruments. Pleasure and pain, extrapolating these into the measure of the value of existence, is absurd for Nietzsche, because the reason why you feel pain or pleasure is for the purposes of life, for the biological purposes of which you are, a vessel. And so he says a very radical thing, that we would have pain increased more than ever. And this has to do with his idea that, of those human beings he has any concern for, he wishes them to experience deep, profound suffering, because he thinks living dangerously or will be the path to happiness, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. These are very familiar ideas, even to those who only have a cursory familiarity with Nietzsche. And he states it, this passage is remarkable for no other reason that he states it very straightforwardly and radically. He states it in extreme terms, that oftentimes that seems like the kind of criticism people will make of Nietzsche, that, well, wouldn't his philosophy suggest we should elevate pain and suffering to the maximum? And here Nietzsche says yes, right? We should. Now, I think there are perhaps reasons for thinking that Nietzsche might not need to be taken necessarily so seriously here. I'm thinking of that letter he sent to Overbeck where he said that, sometimes when he's feeling particularly bad, particularly ill, and a lot of pain himself, he responds by, sort of like straightening his back and taking on this warrior spirit and writing the harshest, most hard to swallow philosophy that he can. And I definitely detect this in this passage, that Nietzsche is somebody who is suffering worse than ever. And he suggests, and he has made this suffering that he experiences into something which he calls good and elevating of himself, as something that has tempered him and made him better. He's had to reinterpret his suffering that way in order to cope with it. And so here he's suggesting maybe this would be a tempering force for the world. Maybe I could impose the kind of suffering that I feel upon all the world in order to make all the world as deep and profound as I am. And part of this is as a rebuke to this contrast of Nietzsche's pity for the exception versus the pity for the botched, the weak, the helpless, the Christian pity, right? He says our pity is a higher and more far-sighted pity. And it's not just pity for the exception for the sake of the exception. He's seeing how your pity makes man small. And this is really the basis of Nietzsche's critique of pity, right? Pity is at the root of all of those normative ethical frameworks that he mentioned. They're all based on reducing suffering and increasing pleasure. And Nietzsche is saying the direction in which that makes man proceed is actually far worse than if we were to heighten suffering. And that doesn't mean a reduction of pleasure either, that even the perceived inverse relationship between suffer and pleasuring we have wrong. That it might be, he speculates elsewhere, required that we have great suffering in order to experience the greatest pleasures. That they might not be mutually exclusive, but actually required for one another. And this is part of why he finds it so abhorrent, the doctrine of abolishing suffering. But what I just want to focus in on here is that, in a way, Nietzsche is saying, my pity for the exception is based on he's very self-aware of the ways in which this could make him into simply another kind of moralist, and he draws attention to that and is self-critical of that, which is, I think, his way of keeping those problems at bay. But he is saying that, broadly speaking, my concern with the exception, with the mutation, is going to push the species in the direction of the overman, endless transformation in a life-promoting way, which means greater and greater power, greater and greater challenges, greater and greater complexity, beauty, and so on and so forth. The more rarefied desires become possible, a fuller, richer, far greater experience of life, a deeper laughter and joy in life than anything we could ever imagine. That is what waits for mankind, or whatever it is that mankind will become, down the road that I would set us on, which is concerned with the exception, the concern with the norm, and bringing everything both up to the norm and down from the higher positions of spirituality or success or dominion or whatever it might be, down to this equal level, and the elimination of all suffering. That is the road to the last man, a forever life undermining, a forever life diminishing. This is what it is that makes man small. And so we'll continue with the passage. Quote, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? That tension of the soul in unhappiness which cultivates its strength, its shudders face to face with great ruin, its inventiveness and courage in enduring, persevering, interpreting, and exploiting suffering, and whatever has been granted to it of profundity, secret, mask, spirit, cunning, greatness, was it not granted to it through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? In man, creature and creator are united. In man there is material, fragment, excess, clay, dirt, nonsense, chaos. But in man there is also creator, form giver, hammer hardness, spectator divinity, and seventh day. Do you understand this contrast? And that your pity is for the creature in man, for what must be formed, broken, forged, torn, burnt, made incandescent, and purified, that which necessarily must and should suffer. And our pity, do you not comprehend for whom our converse pity is, when it resists your pity as the worst of all pamperings and weaknesses? Thus it is pity versus pity. But to say it once more, there are higher problems than all problems of pleasure, pain, and pity, and every philosophy that stops with them is a naivete." end quote. So that last line, I think, is very important. I think most of what Nietzsche says is not only easy to understand, especially if you read it a few times, but we've also, I believe the last episodes of season 2, I think it was on the Meaning of Life episode, or maybe on the At Noon episode. It was 47 or 48, where we've talked about this passage before, and that the long and short of it is, as we've said, this discipline of suffering has created all the enhancements of man so far. That it's in fact the only thing that can enhance and make people, quote unquote, better. Better adjusted for life, stronger, healthier, happier. He says that, it's his pity for the creator versus their pity for the creature, that which is created, right? And that both exist within mankind. We could say within the microcosmic scale and the macrocosmic scale. And that's what Nietzsche's saying has both individual psychological implications and political implications, depending on how you want to read it. And it's pity versus pity, and yet there are higher things than even all of this concern with pleasure, pain, and pity. Very, very important. That pleasure and pain are, again, only signs and symptoms. They're meant to be tools or instruments of life, not the judgment or measure of whether life is good or not. And so Nietzsche's goal isn't suffering. He is challenging us by turning our normal evaluation of these things on their head in order to show the ways in which suffering and pleasure are not ends, but means. And there's so much self-awareness in this passage that Nietzsche is always drawing attention to his own paradoxes, and that's why it can be difficult to provide a neat summation of what he's saying at all times. But again, I think it really behooves you to take stock of what Nietzsche has said before this and cross-reference his ideas as you continue with the text, as we've been doing, because it's, especially given his comments about psychology and the mask and these themes throughout the entire text, it will really help you when you reach some of these paradoxes, especially in the latter half of the work. Because Nietzsche, I feel like he thinks he's established all of these, sort of the ground in which we are playing, and he's very much being playful with us now in this passage in many ways. There's a wink and a smile to a lot of this, and notice how often he's bringing up laughter. Okay, 226, quote, "We immoralists, this world that concerns us, in which we fear and love, this almost invisible and inaudible world of subtle commanding and subtle obeying, in every way a world of the almost, involved, captious, peaked, and tender. Indeed, it is defended well against clumsy spectators and familiar curiosity. We have been spun into a severe yarn and shirt of duties and cannot get out of that. And in this we are men of duty, we too. Occasionally that is true, we dance in our chains and between our swords. More often, that is no less true, we gnash our teeth and feel impatient with all the secret hardness of our destiny. But we can do what we like. The dolts and appearances speaks against us, saying, these are men without duty. We always have the dolts and appearances against us." End quote. So, once again, the theme of this passage, the virtue of the free spirit, phrased in a way that is appealing within the conventional morality. We are men of duty. That's something that's respectable, admirable from a moral standpoint. We could say, in some sense, the free spirit's duty is to be true and honest to the destiny to which they have been committed. The destiny that, if you can't make yourself to believe something, right, there is a nobility in instead being honest about what you believe, even if that means that you have to gnash your teeth and feel impatient with all the secret hardness of your destiny. If you have to dance in your chains in between swords, right, that by being an exception in a world that's governed by the norm, that is hostile to the exception, which is always the case, right? There's never a society of exceptions. In some sense, that doesn't make sense. That puts the immoralist in a hostile world. It makes him feel he feels more constraint than the person who perhaps doesn't have the ability to leap higher, right? If we're all chained down, but you can't, you're not even capable of leaving the ground, you might not even notice the chains. And so we're slaves to the duty that has been handed to us by our own instincts and whatever it is that is inside of us that calls us to be honest about the perspectival nature of the world and the immorality that comes with that understanding. 227, quote, honesty, supposing that this is our virtue from which we cannot get away, we free spirits, well, let us work on it with all our malice and love, and not weary of perfecting ourselves in our virtue, the only one left in us. May its splendor remain spread out one day, like a gilded, blue, mocking evening light over this aging culture and its musty and gloomy seriousness. And if our honesty should nevertheless grow weary one day and sigh and stretch its limbs and find us too hard, and would like to have things better, easier, tenderer, like an agreeable vice, let us remain hard, we last Stoics. And let us dispatch to her assistance whatever we have in us of devilry, our disgust with what is clumsy and approximate, our nitimur in vetitium, which is a quote from Ovid, we strive for the forbidden. Continuing with the text, our adventurous courage, our seasoned and choosy curiosity, our subtlest, most disguised, most spiritual will to power, and overcoming of the world that flies and flutters covetously around all the realms of the future. Let us come to the assistance of our God with all our devils. It is probable that we shall be misunderstood and mistaken for others on this account. What matter? And even if they were right, have not all gods so far been such devils who have become holy and rebaptized? And what ultimately do we know of ourselves, and how the spirit that leads us would like to be called? It is a matter of names, and how many spirits we harbor. Our honesty, we free spirits, let us see to it that it does not become our vanity, our finery and pomp, our limit, our stupidity. Every virtue inclines toward stupidity, every stupidity toward virtue. Stupid to the point of holiness, they say in Russia. Let us see to it that out of honesty we do not finally become saints and bores. Is not life 100 times too short for boredom? One really would have to believe in eternal life to. And Nietzsche leaves off with a dash there, and end quote. He really likes to do that in this part of the work. I think the ending is perhaps the most important part. Stupidity to the point of holiness, they say in Russia. And he talks about how many gods are devils who have become holy and baptized. And life is too short for that kind of boredom. He says earlier in the text, we'll be mistaken by others on this account. That we might think of Zarathustra's ape, and thus spoke Zarathustra. Just Nietzsche's general awareness that he was going to be misunderstood and put into simplistic formulas or universal formulas, or the kinds of dogmatic moralistic formulas that he kind of pokes fun at here, of making his immoralism into a moralism, that of course people were going to do this, that there are all sorts of people who are not free spirits who would attempt to mantle the philosophy of the free spirit. And, so that's one set of problems, but we don't want to let ourselves in this approach to life, Nietzsche's philosophy, right? This new lease on life that rejects the true world in favor of the immediate world, the world that we actually live in and care about, the world in which all of our desires are directed, the world that we are truly honest about being interested in. And I think much of this meditation on honesty sheds light on the previous passage, we immoralists, that is the duty that we all have. Don't let that honesty become a stupidity. Don't let it make us into saints and bores. Life is too short for boredom. So again, the emphasis on laughter and the playfulness of this passage in our virtues, the playfulness of the entire premise of this passage, I think is very clear by this point in it. 228, quote, may I be forgiven the discovery that all moral philosophy so far has been boring and was a soporific, and that virtue has been impaired more for me by its boring advocates than by anything else, though I am not denying their general utility. It is important that as few people as possible should think about morality. Hence, it is very important that morality should not one day become interesting. But there is no reason to worry. I still stand today things still stand today as they have always stood. I see nobody in Europe who has, let alone promotes, any awareness that thinking about morality could become dangerous, captious, seductive, that there might be any calamity involved, end quote. And just to explain this passage, it is through thinking about morality, taking morality through to its final conclusions, that we get the death of God. It's by considering the morality of the value of the truth, that we understand the paradoxical nature of positing the truth as the highest value. And it is through thinking about, say, the natural history of morals that Nietzsche has given us, right? It's by asking those kinds of penetrating, vivisecting questions that morality itself is undermined. And that's dangerous, that's calamitous. By thinking very deeply about morality, by vivisecting it, you kill it. And that is the same problem as the death of God. That for us philosophers and free spirits, that may be a new dawn and an open sea of possibilities. For the majority, that is a darkening of the old sky, of the old promises that sort of justified and redeemed their lives. So there is a calamity involved. Let's continue with the passage. Quote, consider, for example, the indefatigable, inevitable British utilitarians, how they walk clumsily and honorably in Bentham's footsteps, walking along. A Homeric simile says it more plainly, even as he himself has already walked in the footsteps of the honorable Helvidius. Not a new idea, no trace of a subtler version or twist of an old idea, not even a real history of what had been thought before. Altogether an impossible literature, unless one knows how to flavor it with some malice. For into these moralists, too, that old English vice has crept, which is called cant, and consists in moral tartuffery, only this time it hides in a new scientific form. A secret fight against a bad conscience is not lacking either, as it is only fair that a race of former Puritans will have a bad conscience whenever it tries to deal with morality scientifically. Isn't a moral philosopher the opposite of a Puritan? Namely, insofar as he is a thinker who considers morality questionable, as calling for question marks, in short, is a problem. Should moralizing not be immoral? End quote. Not much of a commentary here. I think a lot of this is self-explanatory given the things that we've already talked about, but it's so succinct. Should moralizing not be considered immoral? Given the way that Nietzsche has led us to think about it, in many ways it should, because attempting to prove your morality right above all the others will require calling it into question. There's something that could be said here about, the way Nietzsche talked about in the earlier sections, Northern Christianity versus the Southern, the sort of the sacrifice of the intellect and the faith that one simply invests in the morality that they believe in, which Nietzsche thinks characterizes the Mediterranean sort of Southern Christians, the Catholics, right? Whereas the Protestants, led by types like Cromwell and Luther, they want to purify their religion. They want to make it logically clean. They're not willing to deal with such tension of the soul as having these like earthly representatives who are fallacious human beings, considered nevertheless infallible, right? And so there is something about Lutheranism and the rebellion against Renaissance Christianity and Catholicism and the creation of the Protestant church, the Protestants, right? The protest and revolution against the impurities of the previous iteration of the religion, that you could be seen as immoral from the doctrinaire perspective of a moralist, right? Because it leads down this road of constant revolution. And as we've talked about before, Christianity has been constantly revolting against itself for centuries now. And the result has been what? The fracturing and splintering into a million different Protestant sects, because everything is questionable and there is no authority to which you can sacrifice your intellect and simply submit anymore, right? No, you have to be engaged in this constant battle and revolt against all the others who are wrong in this struggle to find a perfectly logically coherent moral and metaphysical interpretation of Christianity. That's the reason why somebody who's perhaps a doctrinaire Christian would see this desire for moral purity as immoral. Of course, they would never come to that conclusion, right? But that's Nietzsche saying, if we think about morality scientific, we're making it questionable, and in that sense, the true believer will always find it to be an immoral act. All right, let's continue. Quote, ultimately, they all want English morality to be proved right because this serves humanity best, or the general utility, or the happiness of the greatest number. No, the happiness of England. With all their powers, they want to prove to themselves that the striving for English happiness, I mean for comfort and fashion, and at best a seat in Parliament, is at the same time also the right way to virtue. Indeed, that whatever virtue has existed in the world so far must have consisted in such striving. None of these ponderous herd animals with their unquiet consciences wants to know or even sense the general welfare is no ideal, no goal, no remotely intelligible concept, but only an emetic. That what is fair for one cannot, by any means, for that reason alone, also be fair for others, and that the demand of one morality for all is detrimental for the higher men. In short, that there is an order of rank between man and man, hence also between morality and morality. They are a modest and thoroughly mediocre type of man, these utilitarian Englishmen, and as said above, insofar as they are boring, one cannot think highly enough of their utility. They should even be encouraged. The following rhymes represent an effort in this direction. Hail, dear drudge and patient fretter, more drawn out is always better. Stiffness grows in head and knee. No enthusiast and no joker, indestructibly mediocre. Sans génie et sans esprit. End quote. So really, I have very little to say about this because I think, again, given all of the previous content in this work, Nietzsche's point here, I think, is clear in his own words. This is why, I'll just point out, this is Nietzsche's conception of England and the English culture at large, is that it is a vehicle for this utilitarian approach to the world. This transition from English Protestant version of pity into a pretense of a scientific theory of pity, of a morality based on pity, and that ultimately they want the English morality proved right, and that this is what serves the general utility or the happiness of greatest number, no, the happiness of England. He describes utilitarianism as simply the striving for comfort and fashion. So just, absence of pain, frivolity, at best a seat in Parliament, the illusion of political power being shared equally. And he returns at the end to the idea that utilitarianism doesn't work for him because the general welfare cannot be the ends, for the very reasons we talked about in the previous aphorisms, that pleasure and pain are mere means and not ends, that we ought to have higher goals than this. And furthermore, a recapitulation to the idea that this utilitarianism always represents an attack on the exception from the norm. 229, quote, in late ages that may be proud of their humanity, so much fear remains, so much superstitious fear of the savage cruel beast, whose conquest is the very pride of these more humane ages, that even palpable truths remain unspoken for centuries, as if by some agreement, because they look as if they might reanimate that savage beast one has finally mortified. Perhaps I dare something when I let one of these truths slip out, let others catch it again and give it milk of the pious way of thinking to drink until it lies still and forgotten in its old corner. End quote. And this is yet another way to describe Nietzsche's project, is that he is trying to revivify the values of pre-Christian Europe. And I think what he's saying here is very relatable even to us today. There are ideas that one can find throughout the entire classic canon of Western literature that are illiberal or undemocratic, or would seem to speak to this previous age when man was a savage, cruel beast, and accordingly, it's not even okay to speak that kind of assertion out loud anymore. It's not within the accepted window of discussion, even as we might still teach Aristotle and Socrates and, Le Rochefoucauld maybe in schools. A lot of the beliefs that endured throughout centuries and in these older cultures are not really allowed to be expressed. And Nietzsche's project is simply to bring these into our psyche once again, make us aware of them once again. All right, quote, we should reconsider cruelty and open our eyes. We should at long last learn impatience, lest such immodest fat errors keep on strutting about virtuously and saucily, as have been fostered about tragedy, for example, by philosophers both ancient and modern. Almost everything we call higher culture is based on the spiritualization of cruelty, on its becoming more profound. This is my proposition. That savage animal has not really been mortified. It lives and flourishes. It has merely become divine. What constitutes the painful voluptuousness of tragedy is cruelty. What seems agreeable in so-called tragic pity, and at bottom in everything sublime, up to the highest and most delicate shutters of metaphysics, receives its sweetness solely from the admixture of cruelty. What the Roman in the arena, the Christian in the ecstasies of the cross, the Spaniard at an auto da fe or bullfight, the Japanese of today when he flocks to tragedies, the laborer in a Parisian suburb who feels a nostalgia for bloody revolutions, the Wagnerine who submits to Tristan and Isolde, her will suspended, what all of them enjoy and seek to drink in with mysterious ardor are the spicy potions of the great Circe, cruelty, end quote. So Circe making men into animals again. The savage animal man. Man is the savage, cruel beast. We are transformed into that again at our spectacles of cruelty, which we still enjoy today. And Nietzsche is pointing out the ways in which he says everything we call higher culture is based on the spiritualization of cruelty, on it becoming more profound. The savage animal has not been mortified. It lives and flourishes. It merely becomes divine. So we have sublimated our cruelty. We have made our cruelty into either a fictional spectacle, or we have contemplated it as the deepest spiritual truth of the universe. Is, when the Christian, when they consider the ecstasies of the cross, the torture and torment, the destruction of the justest man who ever lived. This is what life becomes to the Christian, is simply a cruel world in which the best person is killed most cruelly of all. And in this, they find pleasure and redemption. In the meditation on this truth, that in tragedy, this is going back to Nietzsche calling out people for not understanding tragedy. You can go back and listen to the series we did on Birth of Tragedy if you haven't heard that yet, or if you're a new listener. But Nietzsche spent a lot of time in his early career basically addressing historians and classicists who he felt did not understand that tragedy did have at the center of it this inherent spiritualization of cruelty, of the portrayal of the god Dionysus rent asunder in the mask of a different tragic hero in every new tragedy, right? They're all the same character. They're all the suffering individual, the primordial pain and contradiction at the heart of reality, in which the hero is always destroyed. The limited is always overcome by nature, by the limitless indifference and cruelty of nature. And that it's very important that Nietzsche thinks, when people often get really worried about Nietzsche's philosophy, like, isn't he making cruelty okay? Returning to torture and slavery and all of these things? And Nietzsche would simply point out, I'm not the one who would have you return to these things. These things are still here. They're still within us. They're still the premise of our society, is still based on cruelty. We still celebrate cruelty. We've simply found ways to sublimate that celebration of cruelty and to hide the fact of that cruelty within ourselves. And even Christian love has that element of cruelty, as we've described. Even the religions based on love and forgiveness of all have these very dark, sadistic undertones to them. We'll finish out the passage. Quote, "To see this, we must, of course, chase away the clumsy psychology of bygone times, which had nothing to teach about cruelty, except that it came into being at the sight of suffering of others. There is also an overabundant enjoyment at one's own suffering, and making oneself suffer. And wherever man allows himself to be persuaded to self-denial in the religious sense, or to self-mutilation, as among Phoenicians and ascetics, or altogether to desensualization, decarnalization, contrition, puritanical spasms of penitence, vivisection of the conscience, and sacrificio del intelletto a la Pascal, he is secretly lured and pushed forward by his cruelty, by those dangerous thrills of cruelty against oneself. Finally, consider that even the seeker after knowledge forces his spirit to recognize things against the inclination of the spirit, and often enough also against the wishes of his heart, by way of saying no where he would like to say yes, love, and adore, and thus acts as an artist and transfigurer of cruelty. Indeed, any insistence on profundity and thoroughness is a violation, a desire to hurt the basic will of the spirit, which unceasingly strives for the apparent and superficial. In all desire to know, there is a drop of cruelty. End quote. So, two more basically asterisks on this theory of cruelty and its sublimation and the way that it exists even today is first in the figure of the saint. Well, Nietzsche has discussed that in the chapter, What is Religious? Self-denial in the religious sense, self-mutilation, desensualization, decarnalization, contrition, puritanical spasms of penitence, vivisection of the conscience, and sacrifice of the intellect. Right? These are dangerous thrills that one gains from venting their cruelty inward against themselves. This is self-denial as power. That is the pleasure that one gets from self-denial, self-tyranny, self-cruelty of the priest. It is a pleasurable thing to be cruel to oneself even. And there must be a pleasure to accompany it, or the figure of the ascetic never would have developed, right? So in a sense, Nietzsche is recapitulating to that. And then after that, the seeker after knowledge, the philosopher. He forces his things to recognize, he forces his spirit to recognize things that's against the inclination of the spirit. So knowledge is hardness, the ability to take in truth that hasn't been muffled, sweetened, or falsified. And to say no where he would like to say yes, to not let himself be detained in a garden of Armida, to be shipwrecked, as Wagner was, on Schopenhauer's philosophy and say, well, I can't see a way to get any further out of this pessimistic shipwreck, so I'll just declare this to be the goal, right? Out of my own weariness, I'll settle for this, right? To say no to that, to, as Nietzsche talks about in the essay Schopenhauer as Educator, to make war on one's own happiness. That is a form of self-cruelty, and there is a pleasure that one derives from that cruelty as well. That is in some ways similar to the cruelty of the saint. That every striving to learn something that is beyond the merely apparent or superficial, in this there is always a dash of cruelty. And so that's, these later passages in Our Virtues, just as Nietzsche has tried to cast the free spirit in a way that the conventional morality might look kindly on, he then does a heel turn and presents things in this manner, which is almost so harsh that it's hard to look at. But he's, in a way, drawing out another one of the virtues of the free spirit here, in that it is courageous to look at this, to really reckon with those truths that are against our own inclination. This is one of those, to force your spirit to recognize cruelty as a basic condition of all culture, the spiritualization of cruelty. That is certainly against all of our inclinations. So it is that courageousness and that hardness to look at those things that characterizes the free spirit. 230. Quote, what I have just said of a basic will of the spirit may not be readily understood. Permit me an explanation. That commanding something, which the people call the spirit, wants to be master in and around its own house, and wants to feel that it is master. It has the will from multiplicity to simplicity, a will that ties up, tames, and is domineering and truly masterful. Its needs and capacities are so far the same as those which physiologists posit for everything that lives, grows, and multiplies. The spirit's power to appropriate the foreign stands revealed in its inclination to assimilate the new to the old, to simplify the manifold, and to overlook or repulse whatever is totally contradictory, just as it involuntarily emphasizes certain features and lines in what is foreign, in every piece of the external world, retouching and falsifying the whole to suit itself. Its intent in all this is to incorporate new experiences, to file new things in old files. Growth, in a word, or more precisely, the feeling of growth, the feeling of increased power. End quote. So Nietzsche is describing the basic will of the spirit, right? What he has just said of it, he was speaking of the seeker after knowledge. And now in his explanation of it, he's describing the spirit, this will to knowledge, in those terms of a tyrannical impulse. And that the way he describes the spirit, this mind, this Geist, this intellect, is that it has a will to move from multiplicity to simplicity, a will that ties up, tames, domineers, and is masterful. So the will to truth is a tyrannical thing. It's a selfish thing. It wants to dominate the world for its own purposes. It wants to repulse whatever's totally contradictory, simplify the manifold, assimilate the new to the old, to take in new information and categorize it according to the mental schema that it has already worked up over, long years of interpreting the world. That the act even of interpretation, of gathering knowledge, has this domineering quality. Nietzsche is giving us the how in which the will to truth is a manifestation of the will to power. So we'll continue. Quote, an apparently opposite drive serves this same will, a suddenly erupting decision in favor of ignorance, of deliberate exclusion, a shutting of one's windows, an internal no to this or that thing, a refusal to let things approach, a kind of state of defense against much that is knowable, a satisfaction with the dark, with the limiting horizon, a yea and amen to ignorance, all of which is necessary in proportion to a spirit's power to appropriate, its digestive capacity, to speak metaphorically, and actually the spirit is relatively most similar to a stomach, end quote. So this apparently opposite drive of ignorance, which he says is suddenly erupting, an internal no to this or that thing, a refusal to let things approach. He talked about that to repulse what is contradictory. And what this means, so this serves the same spirit of knowledge, that once we have a workable and functional worldview by which we can navigate the world, occasionally we encounter things to which we will readily say no, in some sense having nothing to do with the truth or falsity of that proposition, simply because it contradicts this worldview with which we're identified, and causing us to say yea to ignorance, to everything outside of it, or which does not fit into it, because this entire spirit, this will to know the world, is itself not the ends, it's the means. It's part of this will to power, and thus ignorance of certain things can serve us. We could also say, like, insofar as in even the free spirit within Nietzsche's own project here, once you have reached the point of negating all of these previous moral or world perspectives out of following Nietzsche's projects through to its ultimate conclusions, well, what does Nietzsche write a couple of years after this book? He writes The Antichrist, where he writes, what is the formula for our happiness? A yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. In that book, he says we need to basically come up with a new affirmative philosophy, that it's important to transition from passive nihilism to active nihilism, where we once again create, and knowing full well at that point that what we're doing is an arbitrary, subjective, perspectival process. But we don't care, right? We're willing to have a grain of wrong in our philosophy, and to let ignorance reign to some extent, and to have our valuations in spite of their relativity because of their necessity to us. And we might also think of the aphorism earlier from the Epigrams and Interludes, where Nietzsche says, once the decision is made, an occasional will to stupidity, to shut out all the alternatives, because if there's no alternative, there's no problem, right? Okay, let's continue. Quote, here belongs also the occasional will of the spirit to let itself be deceived, perhaps with a capricious intimation of the fact that such and such is not the case, that one merely accepts such and such a delight in all uncertainty and ambiguity, a jubilant self-enjoyment in the arbitrary narrowness and secrecy of some nook, and the all too near, in the foreground, in what is enlarged, diminished, displaced, beautified, a self-enjoyment in the caprice of all these expressions of power. Here belongs also, finally, that by no means unproblematic readiness of the spirit to deceive other spirits and to dissimulate in front of them, that continual urge and surge of a creative, form-giving, changeable force. In this, the spirit enjoys the multiplicity and craftiness of its masks. It also enjoys the feeling of its security behind them. After all, it is surely its protean arts that defend and conceal it best. This will to mere appearance, to simplification, to masks, to cloaks, in short, to the surface, for every surface is a cloak, is countered by that sublime inclination of the seeker after knowledge, who insists on profundity, multiplicity, and thoroughness, with a will which is a kind of cruelty of the intellectual conscience and taste. Every courageous thinker will recognize this in himself, assuming only that, as fit, he has hardened and sharpened his eye for himself long enough that he is used to severe discipline, as well as severe words. He will say, there is something cruel in the inclination of my spirit. Let the virtuous and kindly try to talk him out of that. End quote. And so a lot of this, I think, is fairly easy to grasp, or Nietzsche is being very straightforward here. The thing that we just need to tie back together to the previous passage is that what he's been talking about, it's the basic will of the spirit, right? The will to knowledge. What he's describing there is the will to knowledge sort of in universal terms, and that it is only, this is the trait that defines the free spirit, and it is this trait of cruelty. That is the trait. He's crueler in his intellectual conscience because conscience is a form of self-cruelty. So in intellectual conscience, the will not to let oneself be deceived, the will to honesty, right, is a sort of self-cruelty. And that's the duty from which the free spirit can't escape, if we already remember that. And so this is the person who will say, there's something cruel in the inclination of my spirit. He has something that fights his will to mere appearance, to simplification, to masks, which is part and parcel with the will to knowledge. Like the will to be deceived and the will to know, he's tied all of these things together, right? That the apparently opposite drives serve the same will. And so we'll continue. Quote, indeed, it would sound nicer if we were said, whispered, reputed, to be distinguished not by cruelty, but by extravagant honesty. We very free spirits, and perhaps that will actually be our posthumous reputation. Meanwhile, for there's plenty of time until then, we ourselves are probably least inclined to put on the garish finery of such moral word tinsels. Our whole work so far makes us sick of this taste and its cheerful luxury. These are beautiful, glittering, jingling, festive words: honesty, love of truth, love of wisdom, sacrifice for knowledge, heroism of the truthful. They have something that swells one's pride. But we hermits and marmots have long persuaded ourselves in the full secrecy of a hermit's conscience that this worthy verbal pomp, belongs to the old mendacious pomp, junk, and gold dust of unconscious human vanity, and that under such flattering colors and makeup as well, the basic text of homo natura must once again be recognized. To translate man back into nature, to become master over the many vain and overly enthusiastic interpretations and connotations that have so far been scrawled and painted over that eternal basic text of homo natura, to see it that man henceforth stands before man as even today, hardened in the discipline of the sciences. He stands before the rest of nature with intrepid Oedipus eyes and sealed Odysseus ears, deaf to the siren songs of old metaphysical bird catchers who have been piping at him all too long. You are more, you are higher, you are of a different origin. That may be a strange and insane task, but it is a task. Who would deny that? Why did we choose this insane task? Or putting it differently, why have knowledge at all? Everyone will ask us that. And we, pressed this way, we who have put the same question to ourselves 100 times, we have found and find no better answer. And once again, end quote, Nietzsche leaves off with a long dash. So, once again, a recapitulation to Nietzsche's central project, to close our ears to the siren songs of old metaphysical bird catchers who are telling us that we're of a different origin than the rest of nature. So once again, Circe, making man into animal again, understanding ourselves as living, growing, evolving beings. And once again, he says that it is honesty he hopes will be our posthumous reputation. And he even says, these are all just these glittering, jingling, festive words that swell one's pride. And there's something that even kind of makes us sick about having to indulge in this. And this is signifying Nietzsche changing gears for the rest of this passage, or this chapter on our virtues, which we'll get into next week. So that's going to be it for today's episode as far as the reading. But that what Nietzsche has been doing throughout this passage of presenting the virtue, throwing an admirable light on the virtue of the free spirit, that, okay, that's enough of that, right? That there is something even distasteful about having to prove our honesty, love of truth, love of wisdom, the sacrifices we're willing to make for knowledge, the heroism of the truthful, that we don't need to swell our pride in front of the many, that we grow tired of this taste in its cheerful luxury. And so this extravagant honesty is to translate man back into nature, to recognize again the basic text of Homo Natura, the natural man. And he says this is an insane task, right? But that those who challenge us or question us on it, why would you take on this task? He's saying this is the equivalent of asking, why have knowledge at all? Once again, implying that it is only through this new path that Nietzsche is charting forward of understanding man physiologically and understanding our ideas psychologically, that we can actually begin to possess any knowledge at all. That if we don't stop before certain, if we don't invoke the will to ignorance in the face of certain assertions or uncomfortable truths that contradict our understanding of what mankind is or what we think he should be, and truly attempt to discern what the condition of the natural man is and what it means to describe the homo natura, as Nietzsche talks about it. That is what it means to have true knowledge, to go beyond good and evil, to see the body and mind as unified, as one, and to understand the physical and the world of the ideal also as unified, as one. Everyone will ask us, why would we want to do such a thing? But this is what it means to have true knowledge, is to stop looking for the answers to the world, all of our world of intelligible ideas. Stop looking for the answers to that within the world of intelligible ideas, because the world of physiology and the physical world is where we ought to look. And that is, I think, what Nietzsche, the better answer, or the answer of which we have found no better, that Nietzsche hints at the end without explicitly saying it. Okay, that's everything for this part of our virtues. I'm going to have a guest on to talk about the next aphorisms of our virtues, and I'm very excited for that. So, with that being said, thank you for tuning in, and we're in the home stretch now. I will be kind of sad to get to the end of Beyond Good and Evil, but also I think it's going to be a huge sense of accomplishment and relief as well, especially if we can get this done within a reasonable number of episodes and get on to season 4. All right, thank you for listening, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.